When Guy Fawkes ascended those wooden steps on the 31st of January, 1606, he held within himself a secret that would spare him from experiencing one of the most gruesome executions ever devised. The events that followed would become legendary, but the genuine terror of what awaited him and from which he narrowly escaped remains one of the darkest episodes in English judicial history. The man commemorated each the 5th of November was destined for a death so horrific that even experienced executioners described it later as beyond human comprehension. Today, most people recognize Guy Fawkes primarily through the iconic mask symbolizing rebellion, popularized in contemporary culture. However, the actual narrative of his last moments exposes a degree of cruelty few can fully grasp. The execution planned for Fawkes wasn't just about ending his life. It was intended to communicate a message through carefully prolonged suffering that would reverberate through generations. The scaffold erected for Fawkes in London's Old Palace Yard had been deliberately designed to maximize agony. Every beam, rope, and instrument had been meticulously chosen to ensure the victim's death occurred in stages, each more unbearable than the previous. The crowd assembled on that cold January morning anticipated witnessing hours of calculated torturous spectacle intended simultaneously as entertainment and a severe warning. Instead, they observed an act of desperate bravery that deprived the crown of its meticulously planned demonstration of absolute power. Fawkes's final action would deny King James I the satisfaction of a prolonged, excruciating death, simultaneously immortalizing him as a figure who opted for his own ending rather than surrender to Tudor justice's calculated cruelty. The genuine horror of Guy Fawkes's intended execution extends far beyond what standard histories usually detail. The legally prescribed method for punishing treason wasn't merely brutality. Was intentionally devised by experts familiar with human anatomy and psychology, ensuring maximum pain while prolonging consciousness as long as possible. To fully grasp the extent of what Fawkes faced, we must revisit an era when public executions were not merely considered justice, but also public entertainment. It was a period where distinctions between legal punishment and outright torture had been deliberately blurred, and the Crown's authority rested heavily on displays of extreme cruelty. England in 1605 simmered with religious tensions. Catholics lived under constant suspicion, and Protestant authorities demanded absolute loyalty. King James I had ascended the throne only 2 years earlier, inheriting a kingdom where religious affiliation determined not merely one's social status, but often one's very survival. From this oppressive environment emerged the Gunpowder Plot, crafted by desperate men who viewed violence as their only route to religious liberation. Guy Fawkes, originally from Yorkshire and a convert to Catholicism, had already proven his dedication to this cause by fighting alongside Catholic Spain in the Netherlands. His military expertise rendered him essential to the conspirators, but ultimately sealed his doom when the plot was uncovered. Robert Catesby, the mastermind behind the plot, had deliberately recruited Fawkes due to his proficiency with explosives and his readiness to sacrifice his life for their cause. The scheme was remarkably bold. 36 barrels of gunpowder, sufficient to annihilate the House of Lords, kill King James I and his entire family, and nearly wipe out the Protestant nobility in one devastating explosion. The blast would have echoed throughout London, signaling the beginning of a Catholic rebellion intended to restore England's allegiance to the Pope. However, the discovery of the conspiracy on the 5th of November, 1605, transformed what might have been a triumphant revolution into a horrific ordeal of interrogation and torture. Fawkes was apprehended in the cellar beneath Parliament, surrounded by enough explosives to flatten entire city blocks. His capture activated a judicial machine perfected over centuries, specifically designed to dismantle both the body and the spirit. Guy Fawkes's interrogation began immediately, utilizing techniques honed by the seasoned torturers of the Tower of London. Instruments such as the rack, the scavenger's daughter, and manacles were methodically applied. Each session designed not merely to extract confessions, but also to reveal the identities of co-conspirators and uncover the entire Catholic underground network. King James I himself authorized the use of gentler tortures first, revealing the calculated nature of Tudor-era interrogations. The deliberate progression from milder to harsher forms of torment was intended to slowly wear down prisoners, maintaining their consciousness and coherence long enough to obtain valuable information. For several days, Fawkes endured the systematic destruction of his body, his handwriting on confessions becoming increasingly illegible, as repeated sessions on the rack crippled his hands. The physical evidence of his suffering, carefully preserved in documents held by the National Archives, vividly illustrates the methodical cruelty that persisted right up to the date of his execution. The sentence of hanging, drawing, and quartering marked the zenith of judicial brutality under English law, reserved solely for those convicted of high treason. This was not merely an execution, it was an elaborate ritual of physical devastation, carefully orchestrated to symbolize the crown's total dominance over life, death, and human dignity. The execution commenced with the condemned being dragged through the streets on a hurdle wooden device, crafted specifically to maximize public humiliation and deny the prisoner any dignity in death. The coarse cobblestones tore through clothing and skin, while jeering crowds hurled stones and refused at the accused, initiating the public degradation that culminated at the scaffold. Upon arrival at the execution ground, the victim was partially hanged, suspended by the neck just long enough to begin suffocating, but deliberately cut down before losing consciousness or succumbing to death. The executioner's precision lay in judging the exact moment to sever the rope, ensuring the condemned remained conscious and fully aware of the horrific tortures that were yet to come. The drawing phase included the systematic stripping of the victim's clothing, followed by the opening of the abdomen while the heart was still beating. The executioner would insert his hand into the body cavity to remove the intestines, often burning them in front of the victim's eyes. Historical records describe victims remaining conscious throughout this ordeal, their screams reverberating through the crowd as their bodies were methodically torn apart. The quartering that followed was equally meticulously cruel. 4 horses were tied to the victim's limbs, but since human joints were notably resistant to being pulled apart, axes and knives were used to sever the limbs. The executioner hacked through bones and sinews, while the victim's heart continued to beat, ensuring the victim stayed conscious for as long as physically possible. The final humiliation involved publicly displaying the severed head and body parts, usually impaled on spikes at prominent locations around London. London Bridge became a gruesome gallery of rotting heads, a constant, horrifying reminder to all who passed of the consequences of defying the crown. This execution method had been refined over centuries, with every element designed to maximize not only physical suffering, but also psychological terror. Spectators who gathered to witness these events were not merely entertained. were actively participating in a ritual that reinforced royal authority, where the destruction of the human body symbolized the absolute power of the state. The Tower of London in 1605 was much more than a fortress. It served as an advanced facility for extracting confessions, breaking the prisoner's will, and preparing them for public execution. The torture chambers inside contained devices honed over centuries, each crafted to inflict specific pains while keeping victims conscious and capable of coherent testimony. The rack, probably the most notorious of these instruments, was a deceptively simple contraption that could dislocate every joint by gradually stretching the body. Victims were bound to a wooden frame by their wrists and ankles and slowly pulled apart by a system of pulleys and levers. The process began with mild discomfort, but escalated to intense pain as ligaments stretched, joints separated, and eventually bones fractured under the strain. Guy Fawkes endured several sessions on the rack, each carefully measured to extract maximum intelligence, while keeping him alive for his public execution. The tower's detailed records trace the worsening condition of his body. His handwriting, once strong and confident, deteriorated into barely readable scratches as his hands were progressively destroyed. The scavenger's daughter, another favored tool of the tower's torturers, worked in opposition to the rack by compressing the victim's body into an ever-tightening space until ribs cracked and breathing became almost impossible. This device was particularly effective for breaking prisoners who had initially resisted the rack's stretching torment. Manacles offered a subtler form of torture by suspending victims by their wrists for hours or even days, causing severe strain and injury over time. The body's own weight gradually dislocated shoulders and wrists, while blood flow to the hands and arms was cut off. Prisoners who endured prolonged manacling frequently suffered permanent nerve damage, often losing the use of their hands even if they survived until their execution. The torturers at the tower were highly skilled professionals with an expert understanding of human anatomy. They precisely controlled the amount of pressure applied, the duration of tension, and when to allow brief breaks to avoid unconsciousness. Their purpose was not merely to cause pain, but to shatter the human spirit, while preserving enough physical function to ensure the prisoner could still provide valuable information. Between sessions of torture, prisoners were returned to cells specifically designed to prevent recovery. These cramped, unheated rooms, combined with scarce food and water, ensured that each day brought increasing weakness and despair. The psychological burden of knowing that each new dawn could bring another round of systematic torment often proved even more devastating than the physical suffering itself. On the morning of the 31st of January, 1606, a cold grey dawn covered the frost-laden cobblestones of London streets. Guy Fawkes woke in his tower cell, fully aware that this day would culminate in his death. Yet the exact nature of that death filled him with dread, haunting his sleepless nights ever since his sentencing. For days, the sound of carpenters at work had echoed through the tower as they constructed the scaffold that would stage his prolonged agony. The procession from the tower to Old Palace Yard was intended as a final public humiliation. Fawkes, alongside fellow conspirators Thomas Wintour, Ambrose Rookwood, and Robert Keyes, was dragged through the streets on hurdles, their bodies weakened by months of imprisonment and torture. The crowds lining the route were in high spirits, treating the grim procession as both a spectacle of justice and a form of entertainment. old palace yard had been transformed into a grim amphitheater of death, with the scaffold deliberately built higher than usual to ensure that the thousands gathered could witness every agonizing moment clearly. The structure itself was a chilling display of calculated cruelty. The executioner, whose identity was carefully hidden behind a black hood, had meticulously prepared his tools. The noose was set at precisely the correct height to cause partial strangulation without immediate death. The knives were sharpened to a surgical edge, intended to slice through human flesh with minimal resistance. The fire used to burn the intestines was carefully maintained at the ideal temperature to produce maximum smoke and flame. As the first conspirator was readied for execution, the crowd fell into a tense silence. The ritual of hanging, drawing, and quartering had become so well known to London audiences that they anticipated every step. The partial hanging, the cutting down while still alive, the opening of the abdomen, the removal and burning of the intestines, and finally the quartering of the still living body. Guy Fawkes watched as his fellow conspirators met their grisly ends, each execution following the same brutal sequence. Thomas Wintour was the first to die, his agonized screams echoing through the yard as the executioner carefully dismantled his body. Ambrose Rookwood was next, followed by Robert Keyes, each death serving as a grim preview of what awaited Fawkes as the last condemned man. All eyes in the crowd now turned to Guy Fawkes as he was led to the scaffold. His legs, weakened by months of torture, barely supported his weight as he ascended the wooden steps. The executioner began his final preparations, adjusting the noose and positioning his victim for maximum effect. But what happened next transformed a routine execution into an unforgettable act of defiance. Standing at the scaffold's edge, Fawkes faced the full horror of his impending fate like a roadmap of torment. He had witnessed the systematic destruction of his comrades, heard their screams, and smelled the acrid smoke of their burning intestines. Knowing he was doomed to suffer the same methodical dismemberment while conscious, he experienced a moment of desperate clarity that would forever mark his place in history. The executioner's procedure was routine and practiced. The noose would be carefully placed around Fawkes's neck, adjusted to ensure partial strangulation without causing unconsciousness. He would be hanged just long enough to begin suffocating, his face turning purple as oxygen was cut off, but not long enough to grant him the mercy of death or loss of awareness. In that final moment, with the crowd holding its breath and the executioner reaching for the noose, Guy Fawkes made a choice that would resonate for centuries. Instead of submitting to the planned torture, he summoned his remaining strength and leapt from the scaffold, his body hurtling toward the cobblestones below, with enough force to break his neck on impact. The crowd's gasp of shock quickly turned to murmurs of disappointment as they realized their anticipated spectacle had been denied. The executioner, trained in the exact choreography of judicial torture, now faced an unprecedented scenario. His victim lay still on the ground, neck twisted at an unnatural angle, already dead from the fall. Fawkes's desperate leap had achieved what months of torture could noted wrested control of his death away from the crown and its agents. By choosing to end his own life rather than endure the ritual, he claimed a victory that transcended his physical destruction. The man who had failed to blow up Parliament had nonetheless succeeded in denying King James I the grim satisfaction of a slow and torturous death. Yet, the executioner was not to be completely thwarted. Despite Fawkes being clearly dead, the sentence of hanging, drawing, and quartering was mandated by law, and the law demanded fulfillment. What followed was a gruesome charade as the executioner performed the prescribed dismemberment on Fawkes's lifeless body. The crowd watched, captivated, as the executioner cut open Fawkes's abdomen and extracted his intestines, burning them in accordance with the ritual. The quartering continued as planned, with axes and knives separating limbs from the torso. However, the crucial element of the execution, the victim's conscious agony, had been denied by Fawkes's final act of rebellion. The thousands assembled in Old Palace Yard. That chilly January morning represented a broad spectrum of London society, from affluent merchants who paid top prices for prime viewing spots to common laborers who had arrived early to secure their place in the crowd. Their reaction to Fawkes's unexpected leap revealed the complex interplay between justice, spectacle, and entertainment in early 17th century England. Contemporary reports describe a stunned silence as the crowd struggled to comprehend what had just transpired. The expected hours of methodical torture were reduced to a single decisive instant. Many in the audience felt robbed of the prolonged spectacle they had anticipated, while others grudgingly admired Fawkes's bravery in choosing death on his own terms over enduring excruciating torment. Pamphlets published in the days after the execution captured these mixed sentiments. Some writers condemned Fawkes's leap as cowardice, insisting that a true penitent would accept divine judgment and punishment without resistance. Others interpreted his leap as a final expression of the very courage that had led him to join the Gunpowder Plot, a resolute defiance of authority. The Venetian ambassador, Niccolo Molin, wrote to the Doge, describing the execution as a spectacle so powerful it softened even the hardest hearts with pity. His diplomatic correspondence reveals that, even among foreign observers, Fawkes's final moments were regarded as a testament to human dignity in the face of systematic cruelty. Religious thinkers wrestled with how to interpret Fawkes's suicide within Christian doctrine. Catholic supporters viewed his death as martyrdom, while Protestant ministers condemned it as a grave sin guaranteeing eternal damnation. These theological disputes persisted for decades, with each faction using Fawkes's final act to validate their own religious views. The economic repercussions of the execution were swift and tangible. Street vendors prepared for a full day of sales found themselves left with surplus food and drink, while the owners of vantage points faced demands for partial refunds from disappointed patrons. The execution industry, long built on the expectation of drawn-out suffering, had to adapt to a new reality, one in which condemned prisoners might choose their own fate. News of Fawkes's bold death spread rapidly across England, carried by travelers and merchants who had either witnessed the execution or heard first-hand reports. With each retelling, the story grew, adding new layers about his bravery, his final words, and the crowd's reaction. By the time the news reached rural areas, Guy Fawkes was already transforming from a failed terrorist into a folk hero. King James I responded to Fawkes's final act of defiance with barely contained anger. The elaborate execution had been carefully planned as a display of royal power, a public spectacle meant to warn anyone contemplating similar rebellion. Yet Fawkes's leap turned the Crown's orchestrated demonstration of total authority into a humiliating display of the limits of royal control. The government's immediate priority was to manage the narrative surrounding the execution. Official reports were swiftly circulated, portraying Fawkes's last act as cowardice rather than bravery. Court historians were directed to emphasize the successful capture and punishment of the conspirators, while minimizing any indication that the execution had not proceeded as intended. Fawkes's suicide posed unprecedented legal questions for English law. Although the sentence of hanging, drawing, and quartering had been performed on his corpse, doubts persisted over whether justice had truly been fulfilled. Legal experts debated whether executing a dead body satisfied the law's requirements, and whether new laws were needed to address future cases where condemned prisoners might attempt similar escapes. In response, Parliament enacted new measures aimed at preventing suicides among condemned traitors. Scaffold designs were altered to eliminate opportunities for prisoners to leap to their deaths, and additional guards were posted to physically restrain anyone who might try to follow Fawkes's example. These changes tacitly acknowledged that the authorities had been unprepared for his final act. The international diplomatic community observed the English government's handling of the situation with keen interest. Foreign ambassadors reported back to their courts that the execution had not gone as planned, and that the Crown's authority had been challenged, even at its supposed moment of triumph. These accounts fueled a growing perception that English justice, while harsh, was not infallible. Across Europe, Catholic communities seized upon Fawkes's death as proof of English Protestant cruelty. Pamphlets circulated describing the barbarity of hanging, drawing, and quartering, while Catholic propagandists depicted Fawkes as a martyr who chose death over submission to heretical persecution. Though banned in England, these publications continued to circulate clandestinely. In turn, the Protestant establishment launched its own propaganda campaign, stressing the justness of the conspirators' punishment and the mercy displayed by allowing execution rather than indefinite torture. These official narratives deliberately avoided graphic details of the execution method, instead focusing on the criminal's confessions and displays of repentance. The annual observance of Guy Fawkes Night began almost immediately following the failed Gunpowder Plot. But over the centuries, the celebration evolved significantly as public perceptions of Fawkes and his actions shifted. What initially was a straightforward commemoration of the Crown's victory over Catholic terrorism gradually morphed into a more nuanced and complex tradition. The earliest Guy Fawkes Night festivities were expressions of Protestant triumphalism, featuring elaborate bonfires symbolizing the fires of hell that awaited Catholic traitors. Effigies of Guy Fawkes were burned with great ceremony, while crowds recited prayers of thanks for King James I and Parliament's deliverance. These events served not only to mark a historical incident, but also to reinforce religious and political conformity. Over time, the crafting of Guy Fawkes effigies grew increasingly intricate, with communities competing to create the most lifelike or symbolically powerful representations of the failed conspirator. Children often spent weeks constructing their guys from old clothes stuffed with straw, newspaper, or other materials, which were then paraded through the streets before being burned. The religious significance of Guy Fawkes Night began to diminish during the 18th century as England became more secular and religiously tolerant. The celebration gradually shifted from a strictly anti-Catholic event to a broader patriotic observance, highlighting English resistance to foreign influence rather than solely Protestant opposition to Catholic plot. The Industrial Revolution transformed Guy Fawkes Night from a primarily rural custom into a vibrant urban spectacle. Factory workers and city residents embraced the tradition with enthusiasm, viewing the annual bonfire as a rare chance for community celebration and even sanctioned public disorder. The introduction of fireworks added new possibilities for dazzling displays, rivaling the explosive nature of the original Gunpowder Plot itself. In the 20th century, Guy Fawkes Night gained new layers of meaning as political activists appropriated the symbolism of the failed plotter for their own causes. The image of Guy Fawkes as a defiant challenger of authority resonated with revolutionary groups across the political spectrum, from Irish Republicans to English anarchists. The transformation of Guy Fawkes from villain to anti-hero was finalized in the late 20th century with the release of V for Vendetta and the widespread adoption of the Guy Fawkes mask as a symbol of resistance against authority. This contemporary reinterpretation entirely reversed the original meaning of Guy Fawkes Night, turning the man once burned in effigy into an emblem of rebellion against oppression. The legacy of Guy Fawkes's final actions extends well beyond the early 17th century religious conflicts. His choice to embrace death over enduring prolonged torture set a precedent remembered and invoked by generations confronted with similar decisions between submission and resistance. The tale of Fawkes's leap from the scaffold has become a powerful symbol in debates about human dignity amidst institutional cruelty. Enlightenment thinkers such as Voltaire and Cesare Beccaria cited Guy Fawkes's final act as a powerful indictment of the inherent cruelty of judicial torture, arguing that no government had the right to impose such systematic suffering on any individual, regardless of their crimes. The abolition of hanging, drawing, and quartering in 1870 marked the close of a long era of judicial brutality that had endured for centuries. Modern historians contend that public disgust with executions, like the one planned for Fawkes, played a key role in the gradual reform and humanization of criminal justice. As society began to question the limits of state power over the human body, the psychological significance of Fawkes's final choice continues to captivate contemporary researchers examining extreme behavior under duress. His decision to take his own life rather than submit to prolonged torture is often analyzed as an example of rational agency exercised under impossible conditions, showcasing the resilience of human will even in dire circumstances. Current debates on torture and human rights frequently invoke Guy Fawkes's execution as a cautionary example of how legitimate punishment can slide into systematic cruelty. Human rights advocates use historical cases like this to warn that any acceptance of torture, even in extreme situations, inevitably fosters the normalization of brutal practices. The modern reclamation of Guy Fawkes as a symbol of resistance against authority reflects broader shifts in societal attitudes toward the balance between individual conscience and state control. What past generations labeled as terrorism is now often viewed as a justified response to religious persecution and political oppression. Guy Fawkes Night continues to evolve, with each generation discovering fresh interpretations of this 4-century-old story. Environmental activists mark the occasion by protesting pollution, while political dissidents across the spectrum invoke Fawkes's name to legitimize their opposition to authority. This ongoing relevance indicates that the issues raised by his life and death, religious liberty, political resistance, and the limits of governmental power, remain deeply pertinent today. Just as they were in 1605, the story of Guy Fawkes's execution challenges us to face difficult questions about justice, state authority, and the enduring strength of human dignity in the face of organized cruelty. His final leap from the scaffold symbolizes more than a desperate flight from physical torment. It is a testament to human agency, even under the most restrictive conditions. The horror awaiting Fawkes beneath that scaffold, the calculated dismemberment of a conscious human being, exposes how far a civilized society can descend when vengeance masquerades as justice. The fact that such executions were deemed not only lawful but necessary to preserve social order reveals how easily cruelty can become normalized when it serves the interests of those in power. Yet Fawkes's last defiant act shows that human dignity cannot be easily extinguished, even amid the most relentless efforts to dehumanize. His decision to die on his own terms, rather than submit to the prescribed torture ritual, stands as a triumph of the human spirit over institutional cruelty, a powerful reminder that, even in our darkest hours, we possess the power to determine how we respond to oppression. The transformation of Guy Fawkes, from condemned terrorist to folk hero, mirrors our own evolving understanding of the complex relationship between individual conscience and state authority. Each generation sees in his story a reflection of their own struggles with power, resistance, and the cost of defending deeply held convictions. The cruel methods of torture and execution inflicted on Guy Fawkes and his fellow conspirators belong to a grim chapter in human history that we would rather forget. Yet there is value in remembering these atrocities, not to glorify them, but to comprehend how easily societies can descend into barbarism when fear and hatred overshadow compassion and justice. As we light our bonfires each the 5th of November and watch the sparks soar into the night, we would do well to remember not only the man whose name we invoke, but also the profound questions his story raises about power, justice, and human dignity. In a world where torture and systematic cruelty have not vanished but merely changed form, the 400-year-old tale of Guy Fawkes remains unsettlingly relevant. The true horror of Guy Fawkes's intended execution lies not only in the physical brutality planned, but also in the casual acceptance of such cruelty as ordinary and necessary. His final act of defiance reminds us that even in our bleakest moments, we hold the power to choose dignity over submission, courage over obedience, and hope over despair. This choice, made in a desperate moment 4 centuries ago, continues to resonate through history as a testament to both the darkest and most noble aspects of human nature.